Well, I would like to begin my message this Easter morning by sharing with you a story. It's a story by Heather Lynn Hansen. And although it sounds like a children's story, it's actually a story that will resonate with anyone, regardless of your age. It's a story about two children, a brother and a sister, named Roberto and Ramona. And Roberto and Ramona have a dog named Felice. And the three of them would roam around the neighborhood together. Sometimes Felice would chase squirrels. Other times he would join the kids at an old tree stump where they would sit together. Felice's tongue would be hanging out and his tail would be wagging as they rested. And the children would look into Felice's big brown eyes and they would tell him things like their joys and their sorrows. And it seemed like Felice really understood what they were saying. Now, sometimes when they walked home, they had to pass by a supermarket where some older kids would stand out front and make fun of Roberto and Ramona. But Felice would always growl at those bigger kids, and they would leave Roberto and Ramona alone. But one day, something horrible happened. Felice died. The children cried and cried, and then they buried his body in the garden. A few days later, when they were walking home from school, they saw a dog approaching them. The dog reminded them so much of Felice. The dog was chasing squirrels, and the dog came to sit with them on that old tree stump, wagging his tail, just like Felice. And as they looked into the dog's eyes, they felt the presence of Felice. And it was real, very real. And then the dog left them. As they continued home, Roberto and Ramona passed by that supermarket, and those older kids were there. And even though Felice was no longer with them, they felt Felice's presence and power with them. And they bravely walked past those kids who left them alone. And when they got home, Roberto and Ramona said to their mom, "Mom, is it possible that Felice has been reincarnated in another dog? Is it possible that Felice is maybe a ghost or an angel?" And their mom said, "I don't know about any of that. But what I do know is that Felice is alive. He lives. Every time you remember him, he lives with you and within you." Now, I love that story because it's such a simple story, but it explains to us a profound spiritual truth. And that truth is that death is an illusion. The truth is that we are not physical beings having spiritual experiences from time to time. No, we are eternal spiritual beings in just a temporary physical existence. Felice's body was in the ground, but his spirit, his presence lived on. That's the Easter story. Jesus' body was in the tomb, but the tomb couldn't contain his spirit and his light. That lived on in his loved ones, and it lives on in us. It lives on in me, and it lives on in you. That's what we're celebrating today. Now, the world's greatest theologians and biblical scholars, they have no idea the exact date that Jesus died. It was the early church fathers who decided to celebrate Easter during the time around the spring solstice. Now, if you were with us back in December, I told you they also didn't know the exact date that Jesus was born. They decided to have it around the time of the winter solstice. The solstice is the celebration of the light of the sun, S-U-N. So what we're celebrating is God at the beginning of all of creation. Remember when God created everything, God said, "Let there be light." That light is the Christ. And so Christmas is the birth of the light. And Easter today, we're celebrating the rebirth of the light. The name Easter comes from a pagan goddess whose name is Eastar, and she is the goddess of spring. Before Christianity, people of many different cultures and traditions celebrated spring, celebrated the light. Think about it. In the springtime, we are celebrating because what appeared dead in winter is now coming back to life. Look at the ground. The plants are popping out of the ground. We're seeing buds appearing on the trees. Things are coming back to life. That's rebirth, regrowth, and resurrection. If you receive our church newsletter, you know this week I had a quote from the theologian, monk, and Christian reformer whose name was Martin Luther. And Martin Luther wrote, "God has written the promise of resurrection, not just in books, but in every leaf in springtime." So what we're remembering today is during the winters of our life, during the dark times in our life, where it feels like we've been buried, we've actually been planted. That new growth and new life is on its way. We're remembering that during times of darkness, the light is still with us. The Gospel of John that we're reading from today, John's Gospel begins with, "Light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." That light cannot be extinguished. That is what we're celebrating today. Now, we as progressive Christians, we know that the stories of the Bible are meant to be understood symbolically, not literally. The Bible is not a history book. It's a book of stories that are meant to be understood spiritually, metaphysically. And most progressive Christians I know, they say, well, I don't really literally believe in a talking snake. I don't literally believe that Jonah lived inside of a fish for 3 days. I don't literally believe in Noah's Ark or in the virgin birth, but I understand those stories symbolically. And yet, there are many progressive Christians I know who draw the line at the resurrection story. They say, yeah, the talking fish and yeah, that's the talking snake and the fish, those are all symbols. But no, Jesus literally did physically rise from the dead. That's the one that we can't question. Now, when I questioned it a few years ago, someone from this church came up to me and said, "Pastor Sal, if Jesus didn't physically rise from the dead, what in the world are we doing here? Why are we coming here every Sunday? Isn't that what Christianity is about? Isn't that what our faith is based on?" Well, as we heard in our words of integration and guidance this morning, the earliest gospel writers, people like Mark and Luke, never wrote stories about Jesus' physical resurrection. And Paul, in all of his letters to the early Christians, never described Jesus' resurrection as the physical resuscitation of a body. Wouldn't you think if something so extraordinary had happened that those early writers would have written about it? The story we're reading from is from John's Gospel, the very last to be written, generations after Jesus lived. And notice even in that story, Mary Magdalene does not recognize Jesus. She sees a gardener. Could it be that Mary felt the presence of Jesus in that gardener, like Roberto and Ramona felt the presence of Felice after he had died? I think what the early Christian writers were trying to explain was that even though Jesus had died, his light, his life, his power, and his presence lived on in them. Now, we have a mission statement in our church. It was written many years ago, well before I was the pastor here. And part of that mission statement says that we are a church that is more about the questions than the answers. So I don't know if Jesus physically rose from the dead or not. But I'll tell you what I do know, and I know it for sure. Resurrection is real, very real. And how do I know that? Because I have experienced it firsthand in my life. A man who lived more than 2,000 years ago lives on in me. I have felt his presence, his power, and it is real, very real. And I know that you have felt it too. And that's why we're here every Sunday. That's the basis of our faith. All of us have been entombed, but the tomb we broke free from. We've awakened. We have resurrected. We are rising to a higher place of consciousness. We're awakening to the truth of our being. Jesus said the truth of your being is that you are the light of the world and that you are sons and daughters of God. That's what we're celebrating today. We're not commemorating one man who rose from the dead 2,000 years ago. We're celebrating the resurrection of the light in us. Christianity, unfortunately, has become a religion where we worship one man who resurrected the light. What he wanted was for us to follow his way, to do as he did, to resurrect the light within us. At the Big Bang, when God created everything and said, "Let there be light," that was the Christ. And that was billions of years before Jesus of Nazareth was even born. Jesus was a human being who was able to manifest that light fully. And he said you could do it too, and he came to show you the way. So what Easter is about, when we say we are Easter people, it means we are people who are committed to recognizing that light within us, to awaken it, and to arise to a higher place so that we can shine that light for all of the world to see. And that's why at Easter, we don't say Jesus has risen. It's not past. We say Christ is risen. It happens now. The second coming of the Christ isn't a future event. The second coming of the Christ happens now, and it happens within you. That's what Easter is. We're celebrating that today. So on this Easter morning, may you more fully recognize the truth of your being, that the light of the Christ, God's DNA, is within you. May you awaken to that truth, and may you help others to recognize that light is within them. May you help them awaken. Because together, the more and more of us who arise, we will transform the world with this light and this life, this power and this presence. Happy Easter and namaste.